swallow. So, split up into 4 phases. Your oral prep phase, your oral phase, your pharyngeal phase, and your esophageal phase. So, a lot of stuff is in phase 3, that pharyngeal phase, but nevertheless, we start with our oral prep phase. Our oral prep phase is mainly sensory. There is motor with like chewing and preparing the bolus, but there's a lot of leading up to the bolus being in our mouth. There is sight, smell, taste, how hot it is, how cold it is, things like that. Is it a liquid, a solid, something in between? So, rotary chew, mastication, is because it rotates through your mouth from tongue to teeth, tongue to teeth. Your tongue actually puts the bolus on your teeth where it's chewed, and then it falls back into your tongue. During this process, all of oral prep, your larynx and your pharynx are at rest, and you are breathing through your nasal passageway. Looking at the tongue, starting with the sensory part of the tongue, there are mechanoreceptors, which is touch. There are the thermal components, which are cold spots and hot spots. Hot spots are at the front of the mouth so that you know if you're about to get burnt, that you can have enough time to spit it out. And I want to look up chemosensitive receptors. They are chemical levels. So I have a feeling it probably has to do with taste buds, taste sensations, sensitive to chemicals of food that are digested. So you've got touch, taste, temperature. There's a high innervation ratio where the tongue and the palate connect. So now that we've looked at sensory, we're going to look at motor. The tongue muscles can be divided into extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic is the process of the point of those muscles is to move your tongue side to side, up and down, those big movements, and that's your genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus, and paladoglossus. Your intrinsic are the ones that create the central groove for the bolus to rest on, and that's going to be the inferior and superior longitudinal, transverse, and vertical muscles. The tongue can be separated into 2 different parts. There is the oral tongue and the pharyngeal tongue, or the oral tongue and the base of the tongue. And so the oral tongue is the tip of your tongue, the dorsum, the blade, back to the circumvallate papillae, which is right underneath your uvula. This part of your tongue is voluntary. You move it while talking, you move it while you're chewing. And then the tongue base is involuntary, and that's the circumvallate papillae down to the hyoid bone, because the inferior or the base of the tongue is connected to the superior portion of the hyoid bone. So we have our tongue. The floor of the mouth is made up of the suprahyoid muscles, and that's because they're attached to the superior part of the hyoid. There's the mylohyoid, the geniohyoid, and the anterior belly of the digastric, and those just make up the bottom. And then for jaw elevation up here, you have your masseter, your temporalis, and your medial pterygoid. So this is all of the muscles that are involved in the oral cavity. The 8 tongue muscles, as we mentioned, the genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus, palaglossus, and then the superior and inferior longitudinal, the transverse, and the vertical. and then the three suprahyaloid, the mylohyoid, geniohyaloid, and the anterior belly of the digastric. And then for mastication, the actual chewing process, it's going to be the masseter, the temporalis, and the lateral and medial pterygoid that you can like feel them right here. So we then are moving into the oral phase where the tongue is propelling food posteriorly to the pharyngeal phase. So the whole point of the oral phase is to get the tongue into the oropharynx. This process takes less than a second to a second and a half. The bolus is elevated, pressed into the palate, squeezed to the back. A groove is created in the tongue to propel the food backwards. And a little bit about the hyoid, since it's what our tongue base is connected to. I have it right here. So this is mouth, brain. So here you've got your oropharynx, pharynx, and then right here is kind of like that vocal fold area with the true, false, and the areopaglottic folds. And then you've got your larynx and your esophagus. Or I guess like this would be your trachea. So right here you've got your hyoid, and it's connected to the larynx by the thyroid ligament and the thyrohyoid muscle. It's suspended in soft tissue by the stylohyoid and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Just more stuff down here. The hyoid, these two muscles, the ligament and the thyrohyoid muscle, they pull the larynx superiorly and anteriorly, or up and forward. The hyoid and the larynx are elevated by the anterior belly of the digastric, the mylohyoid, the geniohyoid, and the thyrohyoid, which are also your suprahyoid muscles. Plus the thyrohyoid help elevate the hyoid and larynx. So yeah, phase 2, you've got your bolus, you're propelling it backwards, and so then like end of phase 2, phase 3 is your swallow motor plan, because you got your sensory feeding into your motor. And so it's sensory because the oropharynx has a lot of nerves that collect signals to trigger a pharyngeal swallow, because you can have an oral prep phase and an oral phase without having triggered a pharyngeal swallow. And that is a disorder where it would just fall back into the piriform sinus, the valleculae, and worst case scenario, your trachea. And so your swallow motor plan, this was the best way I could break it down. This is using the textbook. The bolus is sent posteriorly into the oropharynx, and the swallow is triggered. These are the sensory nerves in the oropharynx. It's your glossopharyngeus nerve, your vagus nerve, and your accessory nerve. And those are in your oropharynx and in your tongue. They trigger sensory information to be sent to, and this is important, this is your actual like swallowing center, the medullary reticular formation in the brainstem. And so sensory information is sent via the glossopharyngeus, the vagus, and the accessory cranial nerves through the, because of the oropharynx, because of the tongue, to the medullary reticular formation. And this area in your brainstem acts as a neuronal pool, and it organizes the synergy necessary to trigger a motor response. And so it goes from the swallow center, this medullary reticular formation, into the nucleus tractus solitarius, still in the brainstem, and this decodes that sensory information that's been pooling up, and it identifies the swallow stimulus. And then it takes the decoded sensory information and sends it to the nucleus ambiguus, and this is when things start to get motor. The nucleus ambiguus initiates the proper motor plan for a swallow. And then you've got your efferent nerves, your glossopharyngeus and your vagus, because those ones are motor and sensory. The glossopharyngeus triggers the pharyngeal constrictors, the vagus triggers the palate, pharynx, and larynx, and then it also does involve your hypoglossal with your tongue and tongue movement to make sure that there's no leftover residue in your mouth. So your glossopharyngeus, it widens the pharynx and elevates the hyoid, as we know, because the hyoid is connected to the larynx via the thyroid ligament and the thyrohyoid muscle. We do know that when the hyoid is elevated, you've got your larynx elevating, which also helps with opening the UES and closing the airway. And so then you've got your vagus, does a whole lot of stuff. Your vagus, it elevates the palate to close the nasopharynx and the velopharynx. That's to make sure that you don't have any regurgitation up into your nose. And it contracts the inferior and middle pharyngeal constrictors, which those are necessary for closing your middle. I believe that those are necessary, contracting the inferior and middle pharyngeal. That would be to bulge the constrictors to help propel the bolus downwards. So those are contracting. It relaxes the UES and it closes the laryngeal vestibule, which is the space in between the true and the false vocal folds. And it approximates all three folds, the true vocal fold, false vocal fold, and the aryepiglottic fold. So this is your swallow motor plan. We are then, afferent, because this nucleus tractus solitarius, afferent information comes here, and this is where it terminates because the nucleus ambiguus is where things are efferent. Additional input is other parts of the brainstem, the limbic system, the cortical areas. The limbic system ties in with things like the fight or flight, or if you smell something really nice, fight or flight, you might have a dry mouth. You smell something nice, you might start to drool. And patterned sensory input of feeling the sensory input and having the same sensory reactions leads to stereotyped motor output. That is kind of why the pharyngeal swallow isn't quite completely voluntary, isn't quite completely involuntary. It's a little bit of both. So that is kind of our branch from phase 2 to phase 3, oral phase. So phase 3, as we know, starts when the bolus passes through the anterior fascial pillars, which the anterior fascial pillars are formed by the paladoglossus and the palate-pharyngeus muscle, and the bolus should pass through the pharyngeal swallow phase in less than a second. So it can be broken up into 6 key steps. Step 1, elevation or retraction of the velum and complete closure of the velopharyngeal port to block the nasal cavity. What muscles do we need to close the velopharyngeal port? The ones that we need to elevate our soft palate. So our palatoglossus, tensor veli palatini, and the levator veli palatini. And so the soft palate is elevated, it's retracted, we've closed off to make sure that we don't have stuff shooting out of our nose. And then step 2 is elevation and anterior movement of the hyoid and the larynx. We want to elevate the hyoid because it's going to pull the larynx up and forward. This is going to help to ensure that the opening of the larynx is covered by, and this goes into it a little bit more, but we want it to be covered by the epiglottis to make sure that bolus is not sliding down there. And also part of that motion helps to open up the UES. So step 3, closure of the larynx at all 3 sphincters. Those sphincters are the true vocal fold, the laryngeal entrance, which the laryngeal entrance is where your false vocal fold, your aryepiglottic folds, your arytenoid cartilages, that thing where they're at, and then the epiglottis. So it just wants to make sure that all of that stuff is closed up, so nothing gets into the larynx. Step 4 is to open the upper esophageal sphincter, and we do that by relaxing the cricopharyngeal muscle, which we know that the UES is in tonic contraction, as is the lower esophageal sphincter. And so we need the cricopharyngeus to be working to help with relaxing that contraction, as well as hyoid elevation, which kind of like pulls it open a little bit. Step 5, there is a ramp at the base of the tongue that helps to propel the bolus posteriorly, and it delivers the bolus to the pharynx, followed by tongue base retraction to contact the pharyngeal wall bulging. That's why we want there to be contraction of the pharyngeal constrictors. There is no peristalsis in the pharynx, it's only in the epiglottis. This is not peristalsis. It is instead tongue base retraction and pharyngeal wall contraction. And so during this, the tongue base contracts posteriorly and the pharyngeal wall constricts and kind of pushes forward. They meet, they create pressure, and it helps to propel the bolus downward. And the last step is that the pharyngeal closure is always going to have in top to bottom, superior, middle, inferior constrictor, and that is thanks to the vagus. So if the vagus isn't working, not good. So we know about velopharyngeal muscles. To go further into protecting the airway and making sure that our epiglottis is shut and nothing is getting in. Part of that is vocal fold closure and aryepiglottic fold. So the true vocal folds are the last ditch effort to protect the trachea from getting a bolus in it, because ideally we want it to be saved by the other stuff first. And so the vocal folds close, the aryepiglottic fold closes, and this is due to the thyroarytenoid, the lateral cricoarytenoid, and the interarytenoid, which are also used in speech, but we do know that biologically our vocal fold mechanism is made for swallowing, and it just also works for speech. And so swallowing is kind of first priority, and even though those are muscles that we use in phonation, swallowing comes first. So during this closure, obviously everything is blocked. The respiration is going to pause for a while, known as apnea, and those vocal folds close when the larynx is at 50% of its maximum elevation. And there is a motion occurring during all of this where the larynx and the airway protection mechanism system is moving downward, forward, inward and that's because the arytenoid cartilages, they help narrow the laryngeal opening, and the thyroarytenoid contracts to do so. The vocal fold is closing. They contract that way. They move down and in. And then the laryngeal elevation is moving forward, and that is thanks to the thyroepiglottic ligament. And then there is posterior tongue, that posterior tongue at the bottom, your tongue base is contracting, and part of that contraction is helping to push the epiglottis down to ensure that there is coverage for the glottis. So you've got your bolus. So let's say, all of your airway and stuff is protected. Your bolus is going to slide down your pharynx, and it's going to land in the valleculae. It will stay there until a swallow is triggered, a pharyngeal swallow is triggered. If it falls out of that, we do know that it can sit in the piriform sinuses, but that does increase your risk for penetration and aspiration. The lower it sits, the higher risk you are. And so, let's say we have a healthy swallow, the bolus goes into the valleculae splits the bolus in half, so half of it goes down one side of the pharynx, half goes down the other. They travel through something known as lateral channels, and then they pour into the piriform sinuses, and they rest in the piriform sinuses until we get into phase 4, the esophageal phase. So just a little bit about your esophagus. It stretches from the upper esophageal sphincter to the lower esophageal sphincter. It's about 23 to 35 centimeters long, and it's made up of 2 layers of muscle. It's made up of the inner longitudinal muscle and the outer longitudinal muscle, and those contract and squeeze to cause peristalsis, true peristalsis. And so your esophagus stretches from your neck to your chest to your diaphragm. There's a hole in your diaphragm, it snakes through there, and it then connects to your stomach. Peristalsis is an involuntary muscle action that we have thanks to our vagus nerve. And esophageal swallowing should last about 8 to 20 seconds. There's just such a wide range based on the viscosity of the bolus. It starts when the bolus passes through the upper esophageal sphincter. There's actually a bit of a vacuum effect since the esophagus is crushed muscle, and it's kind of like a sock. And when it opens, there's a vacuum effect that helps pull the bolus down into it as well. At that point, there's not much we can do because it is all involuntary. The upper 1/3 is striated muscle, the middle 1/3 is mixed, and the lower third is smooth muscle. And then you have successfully swallowed your bolus. This whole process should really not take that long, but that is just the 4 phases of swallowing.